Well, welcome everyone to the CFE Support webinar series. My name is Debbie Bayless, and today's webinar is about the Day 1 Karnat Bread Company case, and we're going to do a deep dive in how to successfully pass Day 1. So first of all, a great big thank you to CPA Western School of Business, CPA Ontario, and CPA Atlantic School of Business for their great partnership in ensuring that this valuable information is available to you as you prepare to write CFE in June. This webinar is approximately an hour and 40 minutes, and then I will open the floor for any questions that you may have. If you have a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A function and my colleagues will answer those questions. So again, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. You will find that perhaps they will save some of the questions for the Q&A at the end. If due to time constraints, we aren't able to answer your questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to your appropriate province or region. I've included their email addresses here. Now there's two common questions that are asked. Yes, this webinar is being recorded. You will be able to get access to the link in D2L under Introduction, the homepage for Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE in the next few days. Many candidates ask us if you will have access to the presentation deck. Unfortunately, you won't. However, the benefit is with a recording, you can go back, watch that recording again, and pause it at any time if you want to make appropriate notes. So first and foremost, I want to highlight a very important notice, and I'm going to read it. Candidates are instructed to consider and respond to the practice cases or any of the cases that you write in CFE as presented, even though those circumstances described in those cases may not be reflective of the current environment. So when you're performing your analysis of the various requireds, I'll use that word interchangeably with assessment opportunities. It is all about using the relevant case facts that are provided to you, not what's happening current day. For example, you wouldn't, unless the case specifically mentions issues around tariffs, you certainly wouldn't talk about that in your analysis of your day one case. Our agenda today is I'm going to spend some time reviewing the key components of the Karnat Bread Company Ltd, the Capstone 1 case. So my goal is to ensure that you have and you understand the key components from the Capstone 1 case, because maybe some of that information you will need when you create your situational analysis for your day 1 case. I'm going to spend some time talking about the situational analysis. What are the main components? What does integration mean? Then I'm going to spend a time creating a day one, creating the situational analysis and an outline for a day one sample case. So for those of you who are enrolled in Capstone 2, this is going to be the case that you're going to be looking at this upcoming weekend. It's going to be the Capstone, the day one module workshop case. I'm also going to spend some time reviewing the feedback guide that CPA Capstone 2 education team uses, because it gives us some valuable insights into what are the expectations needed to pass day one. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, I'm going to open the floor for any questions that you may have. So let's start with the Karnat Bread Company Limited, the Capstone 1 case. And you'll notice I'll refer to it as Karnat or KBC moving forward. So let's look at some background information. Karnat has two brands, the Sun Mill brand which is whole wheat breads and buns, and they're marketed as freshly baked. And then Chaps brand of baguettes and cookies. They have 3 production facilities, an Ontario baking facility that makes the Stun Mill products, Montreal bread making facility that makes Chaps, fresh and frozen baguettes and buns, and then Montreal cooking a cookie baking facility that produces shortbread cookies. So there are, in order to ensure that you can, create an efficient and effective situational analysis, there's certain components of the Capstone 1 case that I strongly recommend that you memorize. Yes, you will have access to the Capstone 1 case. However, you don't want to spend valuable time flipping through 60 pages to look for the information you need. There's certain bits of information that should be top of mind. So I hope as you're looking here, is the vision and mission statement for KBC in the Capstone 1 case. I've highlighted some key words, and these are the words that you would look at and discuss when you're talking about whether implementing an option is aligned or misaligned with the company's vision and mission. So for the vision, it's to produce high quality, delicious, and freshly baked bread products from Canadian ingredients and sell them to consumers who enjoy a healthy diet. From the mission perspective, it's to deliver Canadian made, consistently high quality, fresh baked breads using only natural, healthy, and simple ingredients in authentic and original recipes, that they're committed to delivering superior value and treating their suppliers, customers, and employees as partners with respect and maintaining high social and ethical standards. So when it comes to the day 1 case, be on the lookout. Has the mission and vision changed? Perhaps some of the wording has changed. It might not have changed at all. But if there are changes in the day 1 case, always include those changes in your situational analysis. So at the time in the Capstone 1 case, KBC had 3 values: long-term relationships with their suppliers, customers, consumers, and employees, while adhering to the highest social and ethical standards. Use only natural, wholesome, and healthy ingredients in all their products. Embrace operational efficiency to ensure long-term profitability growth. Values more often than not don't change. However, in the day 1 case, be on the lookout. Maybe they've changed some wording. Maybe they've added an additional value. Be guided by what the day 1 case says. So when it comes to the key success factors for the industry, it is critical that you memorize these because they're very difficult to find in the Capstone 1 case. They're integrated throughout the case, so you don't want to waste valuable time. So what were they? Secure supplier contracts for their key ingredients, gain a deeper understanding of their consumers, use up-to-date technology to automate tasks, reduce waste and labor costs, and produce goods more quickly, and to be located near their customer. Again, the key success factors don't tend to change. However, they might, and they might add a new key success factor. So be on the lookout when you're looking at the day 1 case. So an important component is to at least know what the board's objectives and constraints were when it comes to the Capstone 1 case. Now, for day 1, some of them might be different. They might all be entirely different. So the objectives at the time that they wanted to achieve by 2028 was to increase annual revenue by $20 million from their 2025 revenue, to increase the gross profit margin to 49%, to add 8 new products to the existing range of products, and to add 1 new geographic market. There was a bank covenant, a very important constraint when it came to the term loan with Grant Bank. The KPC was not to exceed the long-term interest-bearing debt to asset ratio. They couldn't exceed 50%. So again, be on the lookout when it comes to day one. What are the objectives? And when you look at the objectives, it is critical that every time you analyze an option, you need to discuss what's the impact to the board's ability to achieve these objectives. So, for example, if implementing an option increases revenue, maybe it increases by 10 million, it helps the board achieve its goal. Might not achieve the 20 million, but it is helping the board. When it comes to operational margin, your profit margin, well, if that particular option has a higher gross profit margin, if they implement that option, that is going to help the company increase its overall gross profit margin. So it's important to highlight whether it helps. It doesn't necessarily have to achieve it on its own. That means you might need to provide more than one recommendation, but does it help? So when I look at the SWOT analysis, I'm going to highlight the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that were presented in the Capstone 1 case. Be guided by the information that is provided in the day 1 case. So when it comes to strengths, some of them were that they had a long-term supplier contract. So they range between 3 and 4 years. Now, anytime you perform a SWOT analysis, a pestle analysis, or looking at pros and cons, you can't simply state the case fact. That's the what. That was provided to you. You must explain the why, the impact. You must answer that question, so what? What is the potential positive or negative impact to the company? So if you notice here, for illustration purposes only, I've included an equal sign. And I've done that on purpose so that you can see the information after the equal sign is explaining the why and the impact. So in other words, the what, the strength, is long-term supplier contracts. So what? Why is that a strength? What's the potential positive impact to the company? Well, it helps guarantee supply. Some of the other strengths were timely and accurate delivery and consistent quality. Their production facilities were located in densely populated areas. The Montreal facility is located close to the US border. And there were 3 potential new products when it came to the whole wheat product pipeline. So now let's look at the weaknesses. And I'm sure that you've noticed I've highlighted some central and critical weaknesses. And the reason I've done this is because I want you to be on the lookout. Do these weaknesses still exist in the day 1 case? The reason why they're important is because they have an impact on the company's chances of long-term success. What are they? Well, the shareholders had different priorities and opinions. So why is that a weakness? What's the potential impact to the company? Well, what that means is KBC doesn't have a corporate-wide strategy, which reduces their chances of long-term success. Another weakness is one customer, JGL, represents 15% of KBC's total sales, and their top three customers represent 26% of their sales. What does that mean? That means that revenue could be very volatile, especially if one of those customers decides not to renew their contract. The products that KBC sells have very little differentiation. So what that means is they're unable to charge premium prices. And the cookie sales are declining. Customers are going to competitors due to a greater variety. So without changes, sales will continue to decline. So again, be on the lookout. Are these some of the weaknesses that still exist? They might not. When it comes to your opportunities, you should identify the opportunities that relate to the required that you need to analyze. So in this instance, the opportunities that I pulled from the Capstone 1 case, they are ones that relate to the strategic options you needed to analyze. So health conscious consumers were shifting their preferences to more premium price nutritious variety of bread. The consumers with food sensitivities or strict diet requirements were buying specialty breads. Consumers care about sustainable practices and packaging, so using environmentally friendly packaging. Using AI and data analytics to make bread that tailors to the individual's preference. Now for threats, again, I've highlighted some key threats. Be on the lookout. Do they still exist in the day one case? They might not. As I've said, make sure that your SWOT analysis is based on the day one case facts. Some of the threats were consolidation of the major grocery retailers. So that's intensified competition. So it was difficult to maintain prime retail shelf space and retain contracts. Customers' preferences were constantly changing. So that meant the need for constant product innovation to retain and grow the customer base. Highly regulatory industry. So that means if they don't comply, there could be loss of consumer confidence and sales. And the last threat was large competitors, they were able to negotiate lower prices for their raw ingredients, which resulted in lower unit costs. So smaller companies like KBC was becoming very difficult to compete without lowering prices, which negatively impacted profit margins. So I've taken the time to provide you a high-level overview of KPC's financial performance. Their revenue is well below the industry average. They're losing market share. And why? Because their products are not differentiated and they have limited product variety and limited innovation. Here's something I want you to be on the lookout for. So JGL's contract might not be renewed unless changes are made. They want KBC to have a more diversified line of products and more variety. So what's the implications? If things remain the same, there's a high probability that revenue will continue to decline. Gross profits, they're declining year over year, and they're well below industry benchmarks. Why? Because there's pressure on pricing. Their products are not differentiated, so they have to reduce their product. Plus the price. Plus there's an increase in input costs. And when it comes to the cookie division, their gross profits are lower than bread, and the facility in Montreal is only operating at 55% capacity. So what's the implication? That this trend will continue unless the products become differentiated. So when you perform a quick overview view of a company's financial performance, it's important to draw a few conclusions. So, just a sentence or two sentences, and then to highlight the areas or the actions they need to take to increase their chances of long term success. So, some of the conclusions based on the analysis I provided with you is there's a pressure on pricing, plus the increase in input costs and the lack of revenue growth. Well, it's having a significant, and it's a negative, impact on the company's financial performance. The cookie line is not performing well, and status quo is not sustainable. So, where are the areas that they need to focus? What are some of the actions that they need to take? They need to consider strategies that are going to increase revenue and improve profit margins. Having a corporate wide strategy that's supported by all board members is critical, and they need to make a decision regarding the cookie line. So, even when you perform a very high level quantitative analysis for KPC's day one overall financial health, it's important to not only identify what they're doing well, but what are their areas of development? What are their areas of concern? And then when you're looking at the different options, you need to consider how, when they implement that option, will it have a positive impact on Karnat's overall financial health? So, who are the key players? And in this instance, these are the board members and the senior management team. So, all you really need to know and take away from the Capstone One case is who are they? Their preferences be guided by what their preferences are in the day one case. So, you've got Nathan, he's the CEO and chair, and he is a 30% owner. He really wants the company to focus on what the company does best, which is bread production. And the whole wheat bread um, is is based on his grandfather's recipe. His wife, Carla, she's the VP of Quality Control and New Product Development, and she owns 50% of the company. And she feels that the company needs to focus on continuously introducing new products so they can differentiate themselves, keep up with the competitors, and keep their customers. We have Jeff. Jeff is the VP of production, and he is a 20% owner. And his emphasis and his focus is on good quality and exceptional service. He feels that that leads to customer service. And you know what? Even though it might result in higher costs and lower profits, he's okay with that. Then we've got Dennis, who is the VP of Marketing and Sales, who is also a 20% owner. His focus is around quality, so providing a quality product at a consistent price, exceeding customers' expectations, and frequent one on one contact. And then the last member we have of the senior management and the board is Nari, and she is the CFO. And she believes it's critical that the board works together for a cohesive culture across the entire country and that they are all aligned on what are the appropriate strategic goals. So when it comes to the strategic options, again, all you really need to take away from the Capstone One case is what were the options. In day one, they'll tell you which option or options they implemented. So it could be some of these options. They'll tell you what happened. Could be an option you've never heard of. And then you're going to be looking and asked to analyze other options moving forward. So the first one was to acquire Barry's Organic Bread Inc., POB. The second one was the private label production agreement with D&T Food Stores, or DTF. And that was about entering into a private label production agreement with a DTF is a large national discount grocery retailer. So KBC would produce products under TDF's name, and those products would be sold at a price point lower than Sunmill's current products. There were several unfavorable terms, so in the draft agreement. So be on the lookout if they implemented that. Are there still some unfavorable terms? Have there been some issues because of that? Another option was the Montreal cookie production facility. So the cookie production facility. And that was, they were asked by Hillstone's Cafe. So that's one of KBC's major cafe customers. They were saying that they would like them to increase their production to 10 flavors and add a new product. And those cookies would be branded under as HC's cookies. And they were making a commitment to buy a certain number of cartons for the remaining of 2026 and 2027 only. And the last option was to start up a gluten-free bread facility in Montreal. So they would need to purchase a new facility, and the goal was to produce 9 new gluten-free products. Again, from the financing perspective, all you really need to know is what were the options. And then when it comes to day one, look and see if they implemented or used any of these financing options. So the first one was if they acquired BOB, then they would actually, Garnet would lend them $10 million. However, there was an important caveat that if Garnet returned to Canada and there was still a balance on the loan, he could trigger a clause that would give him a proportional ownership of POB back. The other financing option was a note payable from HG Private Investment. So they would lend Garnet up to $10 million. However, they required to have one voting director on KBC's board. So again, with the operational issues, it's just about knowing what they were. Be on the lookout in day one. Do they still exist? Were they resolved? So there was an ethical issue. It was about around a labeling error. There was more sugar that was added to a batch of cookies. And the issue was caught during quality control, but Jeff told the staff not to document the discrepancy and to send the shipment out with a higher sugar content. The board had asked that they were thinking of restructuring the organization. So they wanted you to provide some advice around a new organizational structure. They were also looking at implementing a corporate social responsibility committee. They asked you for advice around protecting suppliers' data, in particular their banking information. And they also wanted you to provide some mitigation strategies in regards to the impact climate change was having on wheat production. So again, you don't even need to know the specifics. You just need to know what were the operational issues and be on the lookout to see if they still exist in the day one case. So now we've gone through the key components from the Capstone 1 case. I want to take a moment and spend some time talking about significant issues. Significant and overarching issues, these are factors that have a significant impact to the decisions that the company makes. So it affects many of the decisions the company makes, both from a strategic and an operational perspective. And these are very important, and you need to consider them when you're analyzing each of your requireds. It will impact your recommendation of whether that it's appropriate to implement that option or not. And it's also important when you're providing your overall recommendations. So I want to take a moment and go through some examples of significant issues. There could be poor communication among the board or among the senior management team. There could be conflicting objectives. There could be conflict of interest. So in other words, a board member is not acting in the best interests of the company. There could be a lack of long range planning. There may be a supply and or production constraint. Now, if there is a supply or a production constraint, this is a very important and significant issue. It impacts anything that the company does. It is critical that you discuss the impact that implementing the option would have on that supply. And if you provide an overall recommendation that exceeds the supply that they have, or you provide a recommendation that doesn't address the supply challenge, that would result in a fail. So these significant issues are important. Company could have limited cash to invest in the strategic options. And that limited cash could be very apparent, or it could be that they give you some case facts to indicate that it's going to be limited because something's going to occur in the near future, maybe repayment of debt or repurchase of shares. There's a lack of focus on the core business, a lack of innovation, the company's inability to reduce costs. The company's competitive advantage is eroding. There's an unrealistic timeline. There's a downturn in the economy. There could be growing concern issues, that there's significant financial constraints, or there could be limited management resources, and that could be in limited management time, or it could be limited management expertise. So if you notice, these are significant weaknesses or significant threats. So there are some key musts that you need to do if there are significant issues. So I want to go through them and then I'm going to provide you some examples. You must identify those issues in your situational analysis, which is the first part of your response for day one. And remember, they aren't always there, but think about which are the strongest weaknesses, constraints, and or threats. If relevant, you need to discuss the impact implementing that option will have on that significant issue or issues. It's a very important factor when you're providing your overall recommendation for each strategic option or required and your overall recommendations. Plus, you need to determine if this is an undirected require that you need to discuss. So let's use the example that, say in a day one case, more than once they've mentioned that management are overtaxed, they have limited time. They could also mention that errors have been happening or they haven't been able to keep abreast of something. That is a big trigger that it's a significant weakness that management has limited time. So when you're analyzing each of the options, you need to discuss, and it could be a strong pro or a strong con. What's the impact of implementing that option will have on management's time? Will it free up management's time? Will it use more of their time? When you provide your overall recommendations, if management has limited time, the very first recommendation you need to provide is an overall recommendation how to free up their time. When you look at and prioritize your recommendations, one of the reasons why you might recommend, say, option A first is because it's going to free up management's time. Now, let me give you an example of an undirected required. And normally it's pretty obvious because they mention something many times, several times. So let me give you an example that if there's a conflict of interest, and they'll mention this, that maybe, Joey is not looking at it in the best interest of the company. That is an undirected requirement. That is an issue that needs to be addressed. So you not only need to identify it, you need to talk about and discuss the implications and then provide the board with some recommendations. So what were the significant issues for Karnat Bread when it came to the Capstone 1 case? There's two of them. And if you notice, these are the significant weaknesses. So the company doesn't have a company-wide strategy. The shareholders, they're more concerned about their areas of responsibility. What do they need to do? They need to adopt a corporate-wide strategy with shareholders' buy-in and common objectives. And the products have little differentiation from their competitors. So they're unable to charge a premium price. They have to match competitors' pricing, which means gross profit margin is going to continue to decline. So what do they need to do? They need to introduce new products that are truly differentiated. So when they're looking at the options, you need to pay very close attention and priority to options that were going to differentiate the products so that they were able to charge premium prices, satisfy their existing customers' request for variety, and to grow the customer base. So again, when you have those significant issues, make sure then when you're analyzing each of the requireds that you discuss the impact implementing that option would have. Is it a pro? Is it a con? And very much make sure that you consider the impact that this will have on and how your overall recommendations will address it. So let's spend a moment and talk about day one. So as you all know, day one is a 4-hour exam. It's that one comprehensive case that's linked to Capstone 1. So in this instance, it's the Karnat Bread Company a few years later. They'll tell you what they've implemented. They'll tell you what's happened. They'll give you a great sense of what's going on internally and externally, and then they'll ask you to analyze other options. The focus is on the enabling competencies. So your written communication, your ability to problem solve. The assessment for day one is done differently than for the combined assessment for day 2 and day 3. So it's either a pass or fail assessment. Now, you could marginally pass or clearly pass, marginally fail or clearly fail. And I'll go into greater detail on that later on. When it comes to your technical competencies, you're tested at the core level. So what are the expectations from the Board of Examiners? And this information I've extracted from the last 6 years of the Board of Examiners reports. And they expect that you demonstrate essential professional skills, which means and includes professional judgment, the ability to synthesize information, in other words, to think on your feet, because they're going to implement potentially an option you've never heard of. Now, circumstances internally and externally have changed, and now you need to examine several new strategic options. It is critical that you perform a relevant analysis. So you focus on the most important factors that are critical to strategic decision making. You need to highlight the internal factors, so the company's mission, vision, values, their strengths and weaknesses in the day one case, and the external factors. So those key success factors. What are the key industry trends? What are those opportunities and what are the threats? Again, focus on the key factors that influence the company's business decisions, okay? That impact their key decisions. Because not all factors are equal. So make sure you're focusing on the ones that are most important and have the most powerful impact when it comes to the decisions that they need to make. So, a key component of your response is to create a situational analysis. And this, you're not only just creating it in isolation, you're to use it as a checklist. So in other words, does implementing that option, is it aligned with the company's mission, vision, or values? Does it capitalize on the industry's key success factors? Does it capitalize on the company's strengths and the opportunities in the industry? Does it mitigate the company's weaknesses or reduce the threats in the industry? Does it help the company achieve its objectives? And does it improve the company's financial health? Because what you're being tested on is your ability to clearly demonstrate that you understand what's happening internally and externally and how that impacts the company's decisions and how it impacts the company's ability to achieve their objectives. Because your overall recommendations should increase the chances of the board achieving their objectives. So what are the common elements of a situational analysis? They are the vision and mission statement, the values, the industry's key success factors, the company's objectives, the targets, in other words, the targets they want to achieve, the constraints. So common constraints are if there's a bank covenant, again, is there production or supply constraint? A big constraint that you have to be very aware of is there's maximum capital that they can invest or funding that's available, your SWOT analysis, and then a quick overall quantitative analysis of the company's current financial health. So again, I strongly recommend that you memorize the vision and mission statement, values, and key success factors from the Capstone 1 case. So again, you have them top of mind. When you're performing, because all of this information is going to be used when you analyze the different options available. The good news is that you can use a factor that you've got in your situational analysis more than once. However, I want to highlight that do not focus on the same three factors throughout your analysis. Unfortunately, what happens is many candidates focus on whether implementing an option is aligned, partially aligned with the company's mission, vision, and values. And later on, I'm going to talk about where you need to focus what are the most relevant factors to consider. When it comes to the quantitative analysis, okay, so that's part of your situational analysis. That's a high level analysis. And the goal is to gain an understanding of the company's overall financial health and identify those potential areas of concern. So some items to consider. As I said, most likely the objectives have changed. Some of them will be qualitative objectives, some of them might be quantitative objectives. So if there's a quantitative objective and you have the numbers to calculate, how are they doing against that goal right now? If there's a goal that the gross profit margin is 49%, well, how are they doing now? If there's different divisions, so it's important to look at each of those divisions. When it comes to revenue, Which division represents the largest amount of revenue because you want to make sure that you're paying attention to that division. When it comes to profit margins, which divisions are having a positive or a negative impact on those profit margins, the company's overall profit margins? If there is limited cash or financing available, what's the implication? Well, if there's limited cash, this is going to negatively impact the types of strategic and operational initiatives that they can implement and the number that they can implement. Take a moment to just include a short 1 or 2 sentences that provides an overall conclusion in regards to the company's financial health and highlight what they need to improve. So, based on Capstone 1 case, they could reduce the pricing pressure by differentiating their products. So again, remember that when you're performing this quantitative analysis as part of your situational analysis, it's not just done in isolation. When you're looking at your different options, think about and discuss how this would contribute a positive or negative way in improving the company's overall financial health. So when it comes to situational analysis, there is an expectation of what is known as integration. What that means is you've included a factor in your situational analysis, and then when you performed your analysis of the strategic options, you've also included that factor under either your quantitative analysis or qualitative analysis. So if it's in your situational analysis and it's included in your analysis of one of the requireds, it would count as one toward the integration requirement. But if you have it in your situational analysis and you never discuss it, it's like it never existed. There are, you can't simply just state the case facts. You need to explain why that situational factor is relevant and how this will impact the decision that the boards need to make. Include the why and the impact, and if possible, tie it back to the requirements that you're analyzing. So when you're looking at your SWOT, for example, and if the demand for organic bread is increasing, that would be the what. Tie the why to some and the impact to the requirements that you need to analyze. So the why and the impact would be is if they implemented or if they purchase POB, that would include that would increase their revenue. So let's look at the different types of integration opportunities. So the primary considerations are the factors that are identified in your SWOT. So again, will it capitalize on the strengths the company has, the opportunities in the industry? Will it mitigate a company weakness or a threat? Another important consideration is if implementing that option, what will it have a positive impact on the company's existing business? If implementing that option, how will it impact the other options that you're analyzing? Potentially, there's an opportunity for synergies. So that would be a very important pro that you need to discuss. On the other hand, perhaps if one option is implemented, a con is that that means that another option cannot be implemented. So those are your primary considerations. That's the most important factors to discuss when you're performing your analysis, your qualitative analysis of the various options. Your secondary are, is it aligned with the company's mission, vision, or values, and the industry's key success factors? More often than not, the options that are presented, they are at least partially aligned. So they're aligned with some of the wording within the company's mission, vision, or some of the values and some of the industry's key success factors. So if everything is at least partially aligned in some way, that's not a differentiating factor. However, if implementing an option is completely against who the company is, what they do, and their values, then that is a differentiating factor. That is a very strong con, and that is a reason not to recommend that option. So again, primary consideration, SWOT, interrelationships, secondary, vision, mission, values, and key success factors. So over the next 30 minutes, I am going to share a best practice with you where we're going to create a situational analysis and an outline for a day one case. And this is for Karnat Bread. So for those of you who are enrolled in Capstone 2, the upcoming module workshop is this weekend. So this is the case that you will be writing. So bear with me for a moment. So what I've got, just bring this back here. Okay, so on half of the screen, you'll notice I have a slide deck and I put it in slides, but I actually would be creating this situational analysis and outline in Word. And then on the other half of the screen, I actually have the sample module workshop day one case. Now you'll notice that in the case, I have highlighted the relevant information. I put in bold letters kind of where the category of where that information would fall. I've done that for illustration purposes only. When I am creating an outline and situational analysis, if the information is relevant, I'm going to type it right into Word. I'm not going to spend time highlighting information, putting in, comments in the margins, and then typing it in. No, I'm just going to type it in if it's important. You'll also notice on the left-hand side of the module workshop day one case, I've included and kind of highlighted sort of what type of information and that's included on a slide. And I've done that so that if you want to watch the recording again, you have the opportunity of pausing and looking at that information in much greater detail, because obviously I'm going to go through this pretty quickly today. So first of all, before I even start to read the case, the first thing I'm going to do is set up my response. That's the best thing about, creating your outline in Word is that you can take that and efficiently and effectively turn it into your response. So I'm going to put it's to the Board of Directors and Senior Management for KBC from CPA and regarding recommendations. I know I need to include a situational analysis. So what I'm going to do is include the different components I know I need to address. So the vision, mission, values, key success factors. I'm going to put objectives and constraints together. And I'm doing that on purpose because it makes it easier to copy all of that information and put it under my structure for each of the requirements. And I'll show you that later on. And then, of course, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and the quantitative analysis. Now, I want to highlight that I'm only going to type in the company's mission, vision, or any of the values or any of the key success factors if I use them as part of my qualitative analysis for strategic option. If I'm not going to use it, I'm not going to include it. Why type something in when I'm not even going to use it and it's not the most important and relevant factors to consider? I want to highlight too that the Board of Examiners have said that we candidates repeatedly discuss the same factors when performing the qualitative analysis for the requireds. And that in particular is alignment with mission, vision, and values. And I want to emphasize, I do teach performance management in the professional education program. So I know that a requirement when it comes to performance management is to talk about alignment with mission, vision, and values. However, what you're being tested on here for day one is your ability to determine what the most relevant information is. So now let's start. I'm going to go through the 9-step process, planning process that CPA Canada advises to use. The first step is to allocate time to planning. So for ROP, which is reading, outlining, planning, I'm going to allocate 75 minutes, and it is an appropriate time, valuable time. And you'll see why when I show you the overall outline and situational analysis. So I'm going to put my start time, 9 o'clock to 10:15. For writing, I'm going to write my response the remaining 165 minutes. So that's from 10:15 to 1 o'clock. I'm going to break that down even further once I know what the requireds are. Step 2 is start to read the narrative. And as we go along, I'm going to extract the relevant case facts and input it into either my outline or my situational analysis. So as we look at the first few paragraphs, the important information I need to extract is the date. So that today's date is April 12th, 2028. Role is we're still a consultant. What has happened? I like to type that in because so then it's top of mind, is they did acquire PBO. So they converted the Ontario production facility to certified organic bread products. And so they're selling bread products under POB or PBO, sorry, and Sunmill brands. And already they have 2 strengths that I'm going to include under my SWOT analysis. So those strengths are they've successfully converted the Ontario production facility to certified organic bread products. Now you notice I've included an equal sign. And the reason I've done that is that's my reminder. I need to go back when I write my response and include the why and the impact. Another strength is the Ontario facility produces freshly baked breads and sealed breads with a shelf life of 7 days. So again, equal sign is just a friendly reminder for me to go back and include the why and the impact, but I'm going to remove that equal sign. So now let's look at the next few paragraphs and what relevant information do I need to extract. So we already have some objectives and constraints. First of all, they have a maximum of 10 million financing available, and they expect a return on investment of 15% over 5 years. This information is critical, and I need to discuss it every time I analyze the different options. When it comes to the financing, I cannot exceed the financing available. If I provide an overall recommendation that exceeds the financing available, that will result in a fail because the recommendations are not critical. They said that they required a return on investment of 15% over 5 years. So already that's triggering to me, depending on the information I've given, that potentially I need to either calculate ROI or I can calculate NPV and use 15% as the discount factor. There's also some weaknesses and another factor of what's happened. So they did retain JGL. A weakness is that the new non-organic whole wheat bread recipes, they're on hold. JGL's annual sales have dropped because they don't carry many organic products. And at the moment, JGL represents 10% of Garnet's total sales in 2027, but they're expected to drop even further in 2028. Let's look at the next paragraph and see what information we have. So here's some additional strengths, more information about what happened, and a weakness. So Champ's bread products, they're experiencing 5% annual sales growth due to maintaining long-term customer relationships. 10% of Garnet's Champ's products are sold in the US through FreshLink. What's happened? Well, the cookies, they added 2 new flavors. However, an important weakness is the cookie sales, they're below targets, and the production's costs are higher than forecasted. So let's look at the next few paragraphs and what's the relevant information that I need to extract? Well, Narni is now the CEO and the board chair. From a strength, the shareholders, they're focusing more on the overall strategic direction and oversight. So that's a good thing. When it comes to their objectives, there's other important objectives that we need to include. The shareholders want to play a more passive ownership role. They're looking at setting up, potentially selling KBC. So they want to make sure that, they're going to get the best possible amount of money they can for their company and their shares. And as a result, they know that they need to increase revenue and increase operating margins. So when I see that some of their quantitative focus from the objectives perspective is on increasing revenue and operating margins, when I perform my overall quantitative analysis, a part of my situational analysis, I know that I need to calculate what's the operating margin right now in order to determine if implementing an option would help improve that. So when it comes to the mission, vision, and values, there's really no changes. So I'm just going to put that as a note. And again, I'm not going to write out those statements or include the values unless I know that I'm going to use them when I perform my qualitative analysis of the options. So there's some opportunities. There's an increase in demand for specialty bread products, in particular organic, plus more organic products across all food groups, categories. There's some threats. So organic grains, they continue to increase in price. Canadian producers are competing for ingredients with foreign producers. There's some information that I need to consider when I perform my overall quantitative analysis as part of my situational analysis. The industry operating margin for 2027 was 7%. So let's calculate and see what it is for KBC. And then in the last few chapters on this page, there's another opportunity and threat. So the weakening Canadian dollar against US dollar, that's an opportunity because then US suppliers are looking at purchasing more Canadian products. It's attractive. There's a threat though. Turns into a threat from the weakening Canadian dollar. It increased the cost of producing foreign ingredients. So now at this point, we've now extracted the relevant information from the first few pages. So let's look at the next page. We've now gone on to step 3. And that's to scan the appendices and reread the requires. Well, in this instance, it's really about looking at what information is going to be presented to you. And if you notice this, so the first one is the transcript of the board meeting. So that's where you're going to get lots of information about the different options and lots of information that you're going to use when it comes to your qualitative analysis. Be on the lookout. If there's appendices that says marketing information or industry updates or industry information, that is a very valuable appendices. And what the Board of Examiners have found is that candidates are missing that. And they have some very relevant case facts that will be part of your SWOT analysis, in particular, opportunities and threats. Because remember, strengths and weaknesses are specific to the company, those are internal factors. Opportunities and threats, that's what's happening in the industry. So those are external factors. So as we look here, looks like we have 5 different options that we need to analyze. Something's happening with the cookie division. Not surprised. Acquiring Simple Grains Inc. GHG agreement. Something about their retail locations. U.S. licensing agreement. So in this particular case, there's actually 5 strategic options that you need to perform both a quantitative and qualitative analysis. I love the fact that this is an example where there's 5. Because your day 1 case, you may have 4 strategic options. You could have 5. You might have 4 strategic options, an undirected required, and or an operational issue. So you need to manage your time accordingly. And when there are 5, unfortunately, what has happened is many candidates have really suffered because they haven't managed their time well and they haven't completed all of the requireds, which have resulted in them failing. And I'll talk about again that later. So before I even start to read the appendices and extract that relevant information, I'm going to set up my response. And I'm going to set it up based on this structure. And I highly recommend you use this structure. And again, the best thing about creating your outline in Word is that you have the benefit of copying and pasting this information. So your heading is going to be each of those options. You need to perform a quantitative analysis. I'm strongly recommending that you include under that section also 2 subheadings, assumption, impact to the objectives and constraints. So you could take that information that you have from your situational analysis and copy and paste it. You need to perform a qualitative analysis, which means you need to identify both pros and cons and then provide a recommendation. So once you have that structure for the first strategic option, then you could copy and paste it under each of the others. So that's pretty quick and simple. So now let's start reviewing the transcript of the board's meeting and extract the relevant information. So again, in the first full paragraph, it restates their objectives. So if you missed it before, so very significant objective that you need to discuss when it comes to your analysis of the strategic options, your recommendation of those, and your overall recommendations is that they want to play a more passive ownership role. And ultimately, they want to set up KBC to be sold. So it's important that whatever recommendations that you provide, that it means that they're able to take a step back and that that's going to increase the value of the company. What are some of the strengths? Well, Narni has proven leadership skills. Karnat has a strong reputation in the organic bread market due to high quality recipes, attention to detail, and quality control. And it also highlights that the cookies division, that their operating profit margin is lower. It continues to drop. So again, that's another trigger that I need to calculate that and compare it to the other divisions when I perform the quantitative analysis, a part of my situational analysis. Okay, so now here's where we start to get some information about the cookie division option. So there's several pros and there's a few cons. So let's extract that information. They are able to charge a higher selling price for certified organic cookies, and that's going to help cover the higher production costs. That's a weakness, okay? We've identified that as a weakness. So there's an example of integration. They can capitalize on the increase in the demand for organic products across all food groups. And you'll notice that I put weakness or I put opportunity in brackets. That's a friendly reminder for yourself that, again, that's an integration opportunity. And it's very clear to the marker that you understand that that is mitigating a weakness or capitalizing on an opportunity. So there's your second example of integration. KBC's largest customers are interested in organic cookies, and it's going to enhance KBC's relationship with FreshLink, which is also a strength, another example of integration, because they're interested in a 5-year contract for 15% of the projected volume. Each time I've included that equal sign because that's my reminder. Go back and include the why and the impact. So some of the cons are that they may lose restaurant customers because they're unable to charge a higher price for organic cookies. And Dennis's focus may be diverted from Champs. So again, there's lots more information we need to extract. So in this instance, it talks about not only, so the option is not only to look at making organic cookies, the option could be to sell the cookie division. So in your narrative, if there is quantitative information, I strongly recommend that you extract that quantitative information and include it in your outline. If not, you could lose it. You might forget it. Again, you don't want to be flipping through all of those pages frantically looking for it. So under the quantitative analysis, I'm putting if they sell, they will net between 17 million to 22 million, including the sale of the building and the production equipment. So what that means now is when I'm performing my qualitative analysis, I'm going to change pros and cons to instead. So pros for converting to organic are cons for selling the Montreal cookie facility. Cons for converting to organics are pros for selling Montreal cookies facility. So here's a few more pros and cons. So Carla is confident that KPC can produce a quality product. However, there's been limited research and development, and they've only performed initial testing. To date, and this is a very important weakness, to date, the cookie division, they have consistently underperformed. So that's a pro for selling it, which is a con for converting it to organic. So now let's look at, there are some more pros and cons. So a pro for converting to organic would be a successful cookie division that it could increase the value of KBC when shareholders decide to sell it. So that is integration from an objective perspective. However, the cons, or in this aspect is really a pro for selling the Montreal facility, is if the facility is sold, then Jeff and Dennis could spend more time focusing on KBC strategy or more you know, strategic options that have a stronger chance of overall success. So they want us to analyze both those options. So now the next few paragraphs give us some good insight into Simple Grains Inc. So let's extract that relevant information. Quite a few pros, some cons. So first of all, from a pros perspective, they produce organic, gluten-free, and dairy-free breads. So that helps build on KBC's strength of successfully certifying and offering organic bread products. Another example of integration. They have a loyal following in Nova Scotia and parts of Quebec. And their products are tasty, which is, there's very few appetizing dairy-free products on the market. A con is, very important con, is that they would need to maintain another facility. And this is against the objective of them, of, of the shareholders. They want to be less involved. So that is another example of integration. Plus, it also talks about the fact of that currently KBC's bread plants, they're operating at full capacity. So I'm going to put that under weaknesses. And I know that I'll probably need that when I'm analyzing maybe this option or some of the other options. So what are some more pros and cons? Quite a few. So there's potentially the ability to sell gluten-free and dairy-free breads under BOP and Sunmill brands to the existing customer base. The ability to sell KBC's current markets to KBC's current markets because their product is frozen or it has a 7-day shelf life. Another really important pro is that SGI uses rice and coconut milk, which hasn't experienced those price increases. So that's going to mitigate some of the risk when it comes to the increase in the organic grain prices increases. So again, another really good example of integration. When it comes to cons, so certifying organic, gluten-free, and dairy-free bread, it represents only a small segment of the market, which means it's limited. It's going to limit the market to specialty customers, which would result, could result in lower than expected sales volumes. They still have to deal with the increase in the organic grain prices, again, bracket threat, because that's going to impact the cost of SGI's organic breads. Another example of integration. And here is our first example of interrelationships. So the only way that they can purchase SGI is they have to sell the cookie division. So that's a con. So again, we've extracted all of the relevant information that we need from this specific page. So now let's extract the information when it comes to GHG agreement. Lots of qualitative, lots of pros, cons, and a weakness that we can add into our SWOT analysis. So from a pros perspective, their business continues to grow due to market demand for whole foods. KBC would be an exclusive supplier with guaranteed sales volumes and margin protection. GHC is looking to expand in the US. And they're offering a long-term contract opposed to the typical one-year contract that KBC has, which is a weakness. So in order for that to count for integration, I need to include it in my SWOT analysis, which is part of my situational analysis. So there's another example of integration. When it comes to the cons, well, the contract does not include the cookies. So that's not going to mitigate the weakness that the cookie sales are declining. They must introduce new products each year, and GHC requires input. So again, I'm extracting the relevant case facts and I'm including the equal sign so that I know that I go back and include the why and the impact. So I'm not done my qualitative analysis, but I've got a good start. Here are some more information that I need to extract. When it comes to, again, there's some quantitative information, so let's extract that. If Garnet doesn't accept this offer, then they're only going to maintain 40% of GHC's current sales of 15.6 billion. So I know I'm going to need that for my quantitative analysis. Qualitative, there are some other pros. Well, the ability to produce and sell new products under KBC's brand. They can replace those lost sales that they're going to from their other brands to GHC to with sales from the private label. Okay, because no matter what, GHC is going to pursue a private label. So if they're going to pursue it, a very strong pro is, you know what, KBC should seriously consider it because they're going to lose some of the sales and those sales could be replaced by the private label sales. A con is that this will almost entirely use up the current excess capacity of at the Ontario plant, which is a weakness. So now, and if you notice that as I've read along, I've actually kind of taken a bold line and kind of marked it across where the information is done for, a particular strategic option and then where new information starts for a new option. So retail locations. Here are some pros that I'm going to extract. Well, they have the ability to develop more products while maintaining 100% control. Though the non-organic products, they can be made on site. So that's not going to impact the limited capacity of the Ontario facility. So that is not going to have a negative impact on a weakness. Another example of integration. They can introduce some of those non-organic recipes. So that's going to mitigate the weakness that they have them and they're just sitting on the shelf. They could use the storefront as a testing market for new recipes for champs. A strong con is that there's strong time commitment. And when shareholders are looking at stepping back. So again, that's integration because that is misaligned with the objective that they want to achieve. So now let's look at what else do we have? What other information do we have? Okay, so oh goodness, bear with me for a second here. So we've now extracted everything we need when it comes to the retail. So let's go to the last option, and that is the US licensing agreement. So here are some qualitative information. So under pros, FreshLink has introduced KBC to AGB. So, we know that FreshLink represents 10% of Champ's bread sales. So this would ensure that, again, it'll capitalize on that strong relationship and continue to maybe improve it or at least to maintain it. So that's a good example of integration. Access to the US market. So it's going to capitalize on that weakening Canadian dollar. Another example of integration. Here's another example of integration and interrelationships. So if they don't pursue the retail location, then there's going to be no use for those whole wheat recipes, which is a weakness. So this is a benefit. Why not use them? Build market and brand recognition for POB and Sunmill products in the US. And that's a very important pro because that provides future expansion opportunities, which is in line with that objective of preparing KBC to be sold. A con is that the products are going to be branded under Sunmill and they're going to have no direct control on the product quality, which could negatively impact their reputation. So at this point, we've now extracted all of the relevant information from the board discussion, the board meeting. The next appendix we have is we're going to use this information for our quantitative analysis, part of our situational analysis. So we've got information, revenue from the different divisions and the operating income. So let's just look at, I want to have a good sense of what's happening from the revenue perspective, who is contributing, who represents the larger portions of revenue, and who's contributing from an operating income perspective from a positive perspective. Okay, so I put all that information here and you can easily, you don't have to calculate this in Excel. You can easily show it in this format. I've highlighted the equal sign because I need to come back and actually perform those calculations. So then the remaining appendices are going to be for each of the strategic options. It's going to have both some quantitative information. It'll be quantitative information heavy, but there are some qualitative information that you need to extract. So due to time constraints, I'm just going to go over the first appendix. And this is step 4, where you're carefully reading the appendix and organizing those case facts. Be on the lookout for not only the quantitative information, but the qualitative information. So in this, what I would recommend is for the quants, this is where I will highlight that information or underline it or something. And I've done it here, highlighted it and put it in bold so you know that that's quantitative information. And what I've done is under my quantitative analysis, I put the page number. So I know I need to go to page 11. And as I've read the quantitative information, yes, I know for sure I need to perform an NPV analysis using 15% as my discount factor, and I need to perform that over a 5-year period for both options. Now, there's some important information here when it comes to the assumptions. So what I want to do is I've got to include that information in my outline, okay? It is not a list of your inputs. That's included in Excel. Are there some assumptions? Are there costs that aren't included? Or are there case facts that indicate that the assumption that you've used could be different? If it is, you need to identify those, state why that assumption might be different, and then state the impact that would have on your results. So in other words, don't simply state that if the assumption is different, the quantitative results will be different. That's basic math. You are a CPA. Based on the case facts, what's the chances that it'll be higher or lower? And will it have a positive or negative impact? Because the board wants to know how much confidence is behind the quantitative analysis. How much can they base their decision on and have a high level of confidence that that's what's going to happen? So some of the assumptions that are here, I'm pulling them out. Well, we're not including the ingredients cost because if that increased more than 10%, that cost needs to be shared. There's no equipment upgrades. That might be something that'll happen. The organic cookie costs, they could be higher than expected or it could take longer than expected. And there's an assumption that they can sell the cookies before they're even certified. You'll notice I've included an equal sign. Again, that's a reminder that I need to go back and clearly state what the impact would be to my NPV analysis. So in this instance, all of these would again increase the cost, decrease sales, which would decrease the NPV. And there's another pro that I wanted to extract, and that's that the supplier agrees to fix pricing for organic ingredients for 5 years. So at this point, I have now completed a full situational analysis, and I've included the outline. So let's take a moment and kind of reflect on the final few steps. So step 5 is taking a step back and pausing. Are there any significant issues or considerations? Well, we've done this as we've gone along. If you use the best practice I'm sharing with you, this has already come to mind. So very important consideration is that they want to play a more passive role and they want to increase KBC's value for future sale. So plan what you're going to do. What's the appropriate quantitative tools? Well, we already know that. We've looked at it as we've gathered that information. And so for most of them, we're going to calculate NPVs using 15% over 5 years. We know when it comes to acquire SGI, we're going to calculate valuation. And you always need to comment on whether the asking price is reasonable. Now, what order should these requirements be done in? Well, that's dictated by, first of all, is there any interrelationships? Is there analysis that and a recommendation of one required that's going to impact another? Well, we first need to look at the cookie division, whether they're going to look at it, whether we're going to recommend to go into and produce organic cookies or to sell the division, because that needs to be decided before you analyze SGI. Be on the lookout, because sometimes what will happen in a day one case is they might give you a required, and it might be one example I've seen is that they had an option where a contract was going to be discontinued. And that meant that there was going to be additional supply that was accessible. So first and foremost, you needed to calculate and determine how much additional supply there was going to be, because that information was going to be very beneficial and necessary for your analysis of the other options. You needed to know how much supply you had because those other options were going to use some of that supply. And then, of course, you allocate your time. So when you're allocating your time, the first thing that you need to do, and so I'm going to share with you, here is the full response that the situational analysis and the outline that I've created. And you notice here I've kind of X'd out, I've kind of, crossed out, and I would in fact delete this information I don't need. But as I'm looking here, I have a pretty good sense. All right, I've got lots of my qualitative analysis shouldn't take me long. I need to add my why and my impact. As I've created the whole thing, I have a good sense of what types of quantitative analysis I need to perform. And then that helps me determine how am I going to allocate my time. So you don't just simply take, this is how much time I have, and I'm going to spread it evenly among all of the 5 requireds. First of all, the order said we can address this in the order that it was given to us. But that isn't always the case. So for the time allocation, so for cookie division, I know that I need to do an NPV for 2 different options within that. I'm going to allocate the most time to that. So for the rest of the options, I'm going to spread my time between 20 minutes and 30 minutes. Again, I based it on what do I already have and what types of quantitative analysis I need to perform. If you notice under the overall recommendations, I've allocated 20 minutes. And that is critical. You need to allocate at least 15 minutes to overall recommendations. If you think that you can put together your overall recommendations at the last 5 minutes, unfortunately, that's not the case. And the chances of you passing are very, very slim. So please make sure that you've allocated enough time for your overall recommendations. And I'll provide additional information so that you'll see what I mean. I always like to allocate 15 minutes, give myself a little bit of time at the end so that I can flip through and make sure that I've addressed everything that I needed to do. So let's take some time, and I want to go through the feedback guide that the CPA Capstone 2 education team uses. Now, I want to be very clear that the Capstone 2 education team, the Board of Examiners, people who mark CFE, they never communicate among each other. So the feedback guide I'm showing you is what they use in Capstone 2. I'm going to show you the one for this specific case, and we're going to go through it. It is not the feedback guide, the marking guide that the Board of Examiners use. Okay, so I'm doing it for illustration purposes only. So the Board of Examiners report is the only and sole source of truth when it comes to how the day one or day two or day three are marked. That being said, we do know that people and candidates who have done well based on the Capstone 2 feedback guide tend to do well when they write day one. So, how do you increase your chances of passing? The first thing you need to know is you have to have a clear understanding of what the Board of Examiners is testing so that you can write your response accordingly. So let's look at the first assessment opportunity is always around that situational analysis integration. What are the requirements? The requirements are that you address and integrate three factors when it comes to your analysis of the strategic options. If there is an operational issue, that you integrate at least two factors. When it comes to your quantitative analysis, that you calculate, if you've got the information, discuss either three ratios or financial statement components. So if you looked at, and I guess before I finish that thought, I want to highlight that if you focus solely on the mission, vision, and values, you will not meet the integration requirements. So when it comes to that overall assessment opportunity, you need to achieve at least a marginal, if not a yes. The goal is to achieve a yes for every assessment opportunity. So don't just focus on mission, vision, and values, because remember, it's not a differentiating factor. It's not the most relevant factors to consider when the board is making strategic decisions. So if you looked at the, the outline that I created, there were 2 to 5 clear examples of integration. And in fact, based on the structure that I have included, that if you talked about the impact to the board's objectives under your quantitative analysis or included it in your why and your impact, there's many more opportunities. So there should not be an issue of you meeting the integration requirements. Now let's look at let's look at a strategic option. We'll look at this one in particular from a quantitative perspective, what was expected. You needed to perform an appropriate quantitative analysis. That analysis needs to be linked to the board's objectives. You need to be able to show them how impacting that option will have an impact on their objectives. Your calculations need to be reasonable and you need to include notes. Now, you only need to include notes for input numbers that you've actually included a formula. So in other words, if you've included 10% revenue growth, you need to include that in a note. Because think about it that the marker is looking at a PDF version. So can they figure out how you arrived at your revenue? You don't need to explain your calculations, okay? You need to discuss the results in your memo. You can't just say, see Exhibit 1. So if you noticed here, when it came to the quantitative analysis, you needed to calculate the cash flow for both options, whether converting it to organic or selling the division, and you needed to calculate and discuss NPV. So if you calculated NPV, but you didn't discuss it, you'll only be assessed as weak. And the goal is to be assessed as strong. Another thing is you'll notice the last line is that you need to discuss other valid financial implications or quantitative considerations of the analysis. Well, what does that mean? That's the reason I told you to include assumptions under your quantitative analysis, because that is identifying and discussing a few assumptions that based on case facts may be different. Highlight what that relevant case fact is and state what the potential impact is to your quantitative analysis. So again, state if it's positive, it would have a positive or negative impact on NPV. When it comes to the qualitative analysis, so again, based on this feedback guide, they're saying that you needed to identify 6 relevant pros and cons combined, that you needed to have a balanced discussion. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to have the same amount of pros as cons. You need to identify, you need to discuss both the advantages, both the good and the bad of implementing that option. You can't just state the case facts. You need to answer that question, so what? What is the potential positive or negative impact to the company? And if possible, relate it back to the board's objectives. Make sure that in that qualitative analysis that you've included at least 3 factors from your situational analysis. And again, remember, discuss those interrelationships among the required. It could be a strong pro or a con. There's potential synergies. So if you end up discussing about alignment with the company's vision or mission or values, you can't just simply state it's aligned. You need to answer the question and address how. So let me provide you an example. So KBC's mission includes products that are healthy. Cookies are not considered healthy. That's addressing the how. Therefore, selling the cookie division would be more in line with KBC's mission. When it comes to the key success factors, you need to not only address the how, but answer that question, so what? What's the potential positive or negative impact? So securing supply contracts to manage the volatility of supplies is a key success factor. Suppliers have agreed to a 5-year supply contract with fixed pricing. Answer that, why an impact, which results in stable and predictable costs. When it comes to your qualitative analysis, based on that outline I created, there was anywhere between 10 to 15 factors that were identified in the case. So there's lots of factors there. You certainly do not want to identify all of them. Pick out the most relevant. Make sure you meet that depth requirement. You've got to answer that question, so what? Discuss the why and the impact. And remember, the strongest whys and impact are going to relate to the board's objectives. Okay, less day-to-day involvement. It would increase KBC selling value, increase revenue, or increase operating margins. There's two ways that you can get a yes for the overall assessment of a strategic option. The easiest way is to get a yes on your qualitative analysis and a partial on your quantitative analysis, okay? Because again, all you need for your qualitative is to meet the breadth and depth requirements. When I'm coaching one-on-one with individuals, I say, make sure that you identify at least 7 relevant pros and cons, just in case one of them's not relevant or you haven't included an appropriate why and impact. So that's how you can achieve a yes. I want to talk about the power of discussing assumptions. So say in this instance that, you know what, calculations were attempted, but there was some technical issues. So therefore they were awarded weak in those areas. But they did identify some assumptions. They talked about the impact. So that ended up resulting in them getting a partial. In the other example below, they did the same calculations, but they didn't discuss the assumptions, which meant that they ended up getting a no in their quantitative analysis. So if you get a partial in one and a yes in the other, you get an overall yes. If you get a no in something, you need to get a yes in the other. Okay. And if you get a no in something, you end up with a marginal. Now, you can get a marginal assessment on some of the opportunities, and I'll talk about how many or what it looks like. Again, simply based on the feedback guide. And I'm not saying this is how the Board of Examiners mark, but at least it is a guideline. What happens if you get a partial on both? Your overall assessment is marginal. If you get a no on something, so whether it's quantitative or qualitative, and you get a partial on another, you get a no on your overall assessment for that opportunity. A no on any assessment opportunity results in a fail. So again, here's an important lesson. Assumptions are important. Your qualitative analysis is critical. It can be the difference between passing and failing. When it comes to conclude and advise, what are the key requirements? Well, you need to provide a supported conclusion for every required. You can't just say, based on my quantitative and qualitative analysis, I recommend implementing this option. No. What are the strongest reasons why? When it comes to your overall conclusion, you need to prioritize those recommendations. Are there any significant issues? You need to discuss those interrelationships and calculate the impact to the capital. Do not exceed that amount. So let me show you here. What happens is, again, say you've gotten yes on all of your recommendations, but you get a partial on your overall recommendation. That automatically brings you down to a marginal. If you get a no on your overall recommendation, so at the last minute, you just copy and paste the recommendations you had under each, they aren't even going to give you credit for that because they've already given you credit for it under the 1 through to 5. You'll get a no under your overall recommendations, which will result in a no. A no in any assessment opportunity results in a fail. So what do you need to do to pass? You need to achieve at least one yes for one of the strategic options, marginal on the rest of them. So again, no on any AO results in a fail. If there's a significant or overarching issue, an undirected requirement is not addressed, again, it would result in a fail. So what does this mean? Time management is critical. You need to complete all of the assessment opportunities to the best of your ability. Here's the importance of the overall recommendations. Getting a yes, getting a partial on your conclude and advise, which is really, because you got a partial on your overall recommendations, that brings you down from a clear pass to a marginal pass. Getting a no on your overall recommendations doesn't matter that you've gotten yes on everything else, that results in a marginal fail. So again, you need to allocate 15 to 20 minutes for your overall recommendations because it could be the difference between passing and failing. So here are the key components. Frame that recommendation. Prioritize, explain why. There's a significant issue, address that first. State why it's first, second, and so on. Highlight those strongest reasons why you are or not recommending, including specifics relating to the option, okay? How the option is or isn't meeting the board's objectives. Discuss those interrelationships. Calculate the capital needed versus how much they have. Don't exceed it. So in this instance, you could say, you could frame it that based on the board's objectives of increasing revenue and operating margins, stepping back further, and potentially setting up KBC for sale, I recommend the following in order priority. You may start with sell the cookie division and the Montreal production facility because it continues to underperform. The board can redirect their efforts to areas that have a higher chance of long-term success. And those funds, this is an example of interrelationship, could be used to fund other strategic options, such as purchasing SGI. And then, of course, you need to provide a recommendation for every single option, even if you're not recommending it in your overall recommendations. So there's several examples of interrelationships. If they don't pursue the retail locations, they could use those recipes for U.S. licensing agreement. If they pursue the licensing agreement and GHC expands into the States, well, they're going to run into some issues. The financing, make sure that you, again, lay out what's available. So 10 million plus anywhere between 17 and 22 million from the proceeds if you recommend to sell the cookie division, and then outline the capital that's needed. So again, I've spent quite a bit of time going through the feedback guide because I want you to have a clear understanding of what the expectations are so that when you write your response, you're writing it accordingly. But this is based on the feedback guide that the CPA Capstone 2 education team uses. It is not the feedback guide that the Board of Examiners use. So again, it's a guideline. It provides some fundamental principles. So your resources. For those of you who are in Capstone 2, you will have access to 3 day 1 cases for Karnat Bread Company, the module workshop case, week 3 and week 6. For those of you who are not enrolled in Capstone 2 and challenging the exam, then you could access previous day 1 cases. There's 17 day 1 cases that are available with marking guides and sample responses. So you can write those because everything that I've shown you as best practices, I didn't integrate and include the company's mission, vision, or values and key success factors. So you can build and practice those skills. A valuable resource, of course, is the webinar series. So make sure that you go back to those recordings. And in particular, if you weren't able to attend or if you haven't viewed any of those recordings, they were designed to help increase your chances of passing CFE. Your next steps is to practice, practice, practice. That is the solution. That's how you get better because it significantly increases your chances of success. We are going to share with you the link to the feedback in regards to the CFE support webinar. In this webinar, we very much value your feedback. So please take a few minutes to go through that. And now I'd like to open up the floor for any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Debbie. We'll now move into the Q&A portion of this webinar. There's been a lot of questions, lots and lots of questions submitted through the Q&A feature. So we won't be able to go through all the questions. We tried to get through as many as we can, but we're going to work through some of the most common questions. And if you don't mind, we will do a rapid fire Q&A
No
at
problem.
you, Debbie. Okay. So the first question in is, well, there's a bit of a discussion around communication and the use of the acronym, specifically the equal sign, indicating the impact and why in or during the exam.
Sure.
Is it acceptable to use the equal sign on the CFE?
No, absolutely not. This is a professional response. It's a professional memo. I'm using it so that it's a reminder to go back and fill in the why and the impact. Okay. The equal sign is just something that I use to remind myself. And I notice when I coach individuals, they use it and it increases the chances of them making sure that they include the why and the impact. Because if you don't, then you're not going to meet the depth requirement, which means that you're not going to meet the requirement when it comes to the qualitative expectations, which decreases your chances of achieving an overall yes for that strategic option. So no, it's just for illustration purposes only. It's a friendly reminder, but it shouldn't be included in your professional response.
Perfect. Yeah, that why and impact are so important.
It is.
So here's another question that comes up a few times. How many points or bullets are required in each SWOT section?
Okay. So you know what? It's dictated by the case facts that are provided to you. So again, you're going to want to pull out the most relevant case facts that really impact the strategic decisions that the company needs to make. So that depends on what's the most relevant information. You don't, you know what? You don't need a laundry list of, factors, but you do need enough to ensure that you are going to be able to meet those integration requirements and that you're focusing on the most relevant. So nobody knows what the magical number is. The magical number is dictated by what's the most relevant information that you need to know when you're analyzing those options.
Okay, great. All right. So another common question and a very important one is how critical is it for writers to link their situational analysis to the evaluation of the strategic alternatives and recommendations
Sure,
on
abs
the
I love that. I love that. It is critical. It is, if you achieve, so again, it is one of the assessment opportunities. So if you do not meet the integration requirement, so if you just created situational analysis and never integrated any of those factors into your analysis of the strategic options, you would fail because you cannot achieve a no on any of the assessment opportunities. And remember, what are they testing? They're testing you on your ability that you can clearly demonstrate that you have an understanding of the internal and external environment in which the company operates, and that you've considered those when you've analyzed the options and you've carefully considered what the goals, what the objectives are the board wants to achieve. So when you provide those recommendations, those overall recommendations, they are the most credible. They are your best strategic decisions that will increase the chances of the company's long-term success. So they're critical.
Okay, great. So I guess this leads nicely into the next question on the idea of integration. So what does it mean to integrate key strategic elements in a recommendation, and why do we need to do this?
Okay. So again, it's around. So when you looked at and think about, reflect back to when I was creating that and extracting the relevant case facts. So I was creating my situational analysis. I was creating and I was extracting opportunities in the industry. And then when I was looking at each of the strategic options, I was going, oh, that's going to capitalize on an opportunity. That's a very good reason why they should implement an option. Maybe It is going to mitigate a threat. That's another very good reason why you should implement this option. So it's about understanding what is happening in the environment in which the company operates. And then with that lens, you're going to look at each of those options and say, are they going to capitalize on the company's strengths? Are they going to capitalize on those trends that are happening, those opportunities in the industry? Are they going to mitigate those weaknesses? Are they going to mitigate those threats? If they are, that is a valid reason for implementing that option. If they aren't, that's a valid reason not to recommend implementing that option.
Great, that makes sense. So if a writer were to restate individual alternative recommendations at the end without linking them, what would be the potential implications for their day one response?
Okay, so if they just simply state kind of an isolation or copy and paste their previous recommendations, I think yesterday I was reading a PAR, an automated PAR for a day one case, and it specifically said, we only give you credit for a thought once. You copied and pasted your individual recommendations under your overall recommendations. We That is not an overall recommendation. Therefore, you did not meet the requirement when it came to prioritizing your overall recommendations. Because again, in isolation, you might find that three of those options are valuable. You know what? They might, more likely, a lot of them are going to be appropriate. But when you take a step back and think about it, well, we can't do all of them. So what are the most important ones? That's what they're asking you to do. And if you're simply just kind of restating what you've already stated and you haven't kind of sewn it up in why would you recommend doing this first? Why would you recommend doing one option over another, even though they're both valid? That's what they're looking to you as a CPA. So hopefully that's providing some more valuable insight.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great explanation of how disjointed recommendations can undermine a strong analysis. All right, so I think we only have time for one final question, and this relates to the discussion around the qualitative analysis and final recommendation. So the question is, if board priorities are discussed in the qualitative analysis but not reflected in the final recommendation, would this be an issue?
Is this okay? So is the question in the final overall recommendations? I think that's what you're asking me.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So
Exactly.
again, yeah, you know what? They're they're testing you in kind of validating that you have considered and you are providing overall recommendations that are going to meet the board's objectives. So your job is to write your response in the way that you clearly indicate how implementing that option is going to meet the board's objectives. Because ultimately, if they don't meet the board's objectives, then there's no value in your overall recommendation. So again, you can't imply that it's going to do it, provide specifics. And it could be a strong reason, again, why you've recommended something, over another. So you do have to be very clear in your overall recommendations. So I guess a lot of these questions have been around your overall recommendations. So I'm hoping the message is becoming very, very clear. You need time to think this through. You need time to organize that response. As an exam supervisor, I start walking around about 20 minutes. I'm walking around a lot when people are writing, but on day one, I start walking around at the 20-minute point that's left. And I start looking to see if candidates are writing their overall recommendations. And if they aren't, I start to get nervous. And then when I say there's 5 minutes left and I start hearing people and I'm noticing that they're just starting their overall recommendations, in my mind, I'm like, no. the chances of meeting the requirements are almost non-existent. Your overall recommendations, practice it, practice, 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 and make sure you have the proper time allocated for it. I've seen candidates who've done everything else well and they've missed the mark when it came to that, and unfortunately, they failed. I don't want that to happen to others.
Wow, yeah, it sounds like alignment. Oh, definitely alignment throughout the response is critical on day one. And
Yeah,
not waiting to the last minute, right? To have that
got
all
it.
kind of put together and down in your response. So thank you, Debbie, for sharing your extensive knowledge on CFE day one and the Karnat Bread case. And that concludes the Q&A portion for tonight's webinar. If you're unable to address any of your questions on through the Q&A, please reach out to your respective regional or provincial body. We would also appreciate, as Debbie mentioned before, if you can complete the webinar feedback survey, that would be wonderful. And just to let you know, this recording will be posted within the Intro to Capstone 2 and the CFE module in a couple of days. So you can pick up the recording and watch whatever you like at a later date. And on behalf of CPA Western School of Business, CPA Ontario, and the CPA Atlantic School of Business, we wish you all a
Yes,
very successful write on the June 2026 CFE. Thank you.
absolutely. Good luck, everyone.